I've just collected all the books that I need to review for this wrap up, and I'm not gonna lie, I'm looking at the titles now and I'm like, the details have escaped me, but we're gonna power through. Hello, thank you for joining me again. We're here to discuss the books that I have read in... I thought it was going to be just August and September, but I've got One Last Stop here actually at the very bottom of this pile, and One Last Stop was the only book that I read in July. So I guess July is a good place to start because we've only got one book to talk about, and it's One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston, who is the author of book talk sensation Red, White and Royal Blue. And Casey's books tend to be populated by like funny, witty, lovable... I hate using the word quirky because I feel like when I say quirky people get like a idea in their head of what I mean, and it's like this annoying sort of like quippy, like not like other girls character. But that's not really the case. I just think that Casey gives a sense of authenticity to these characters. The worlds feel lived in and the characters are up to date on like your latest internet memes and slang and whatever, and that does sound insufferable. I am saying it now and it sounds bad because it wouldn't sell me on a book if I was like, oh by the way they're quoting memes every 5 seconds. That's not the case here. I just mean that the way that Casey writes, the characters feel very real and tuned in and just very like people that you would meet in everyday life, and that gives a sense of realism to plots that don't really have a sense of realism. For example, Red, White and Royal Blue is a romance between the president's son and like the Prince of England, so obviously that is quite a heightened fantastical premise and quite a silly premise, and the characters feeling real and raw and being able to joke and like be sarcastic with each other and the way that they speak, that gives a sense of realness and grounding to it. They feel like real people to me. And similar to Red, White and Royal Blue, this also has like a fantastical premise surrounding the romance. So we're following August, who is a struggling student in New York City. The dream for me anyway. This novel started with like August, you know, being like stressed about finding an apartment and like stressed about not knowing what she wants to do with her life. She's starting at this new college and it's like the third time she's tried to get a degree, and she's just like struggling being like a young person, and I was like, babes, at least you're in New York. I don't feel sorry for you. But on her subway commute one morning, August has a little bit of a meet cute with this girl on the train called Jane, and this girl is very attractive and August is like, hello. And the more that she sees Jane on her commutes and tries to make plans with Jane outside of those commutes, which then fall through for whatever reason, August starts to suspect that maybe Jane doesn't like her, or maybe there's another reason why their romance, their conversations cannot exist outside the realms of the subway, and it's because Jane is a ghost. She's a ghost on the subway, and there begins August's mission to set Jane free so they can finally be together. And I really enjoyed it. I breezed through it the same way that I did with Red, White and Royal Blue. I don't know if it's unfair to keep comparing them, but they feel quite similar in my head, as in, you know, characters, like I said, that feel grounded and real and like people that you would meet inhabiting these fantastical, silly, fun romance adventures. So ultimately, I think if you liked Red, White and Royal Blue, you will also enjoy One Last Stop. Speaking of romance and moving into August, I read all 4 volumes of Heartstopper, and I had such a lovely day doing it. Me and Bea went to the Waterstones cafe. It was just gorgeous. We sat in the cafe all day and I read all 4 volumes of Heartstopper with my little tea and my little shortbread. And then I went home and I didn't feel bad because Alice Oseman is a best-selling author. They've made tons of money already off of these books, and I'm getting them anyway, but I didn't buy them on that day because it didn't suit my financial situation to buy all 4 volumes and take them home and read them on that day. So I just sat in the bookshop and read them, and now when my finances have improved, I'm slowly getting the entire series on my shelves. So yeah, don't crucify me, but that is a lovely way to spend an afternoon. I do recommend sitting in the Waterstones cafe, preferably reading a book that you intend to buy, but I won't tell anybody if you just read a book from the bookshop and then put it back. We're on a cost of living crisis. You do what's got to be done. Anyway, these books are as wholesome and fluffy as you would expect. And actually, to be honest, I'm surprised at myself that I'm using those buzzwords, because I think those are the buzzwords that have sort of put me off. And I'd actually already watched the Heartstopper TV show before embarking on the graphic novel, so I sort of knew that I would like it because I'd enjoyed the TV show. But for years I'd obviously been aware of this series, and I was always like a slightly hesitant to read it, I guess because I think my sort of personality skews a little bit cynical, and when you hear like this perfect love story of these teenagers that fall in love, and Alice Oseman I think has confirmed through like you know, Q&As and whatever that like Nick and Charlie get married later in life, they're like this perfect couple. And I guess what I tend to gravitate towards in my reading is either like fantasy or like contemporary realism. Like I didn't really think that I would be interested in like these perfect teenagers falling in love and having the perfect life, and like they have no problems ever and everything's just so perfect. Like I don't know if that makes you cynical and jaded, but I just wasn't sure if like fluffy wholesome vibes were like what I needed from a book. But it turns out it's just nice. It's just nice. And I remember loving the Heartstopper show when it came out, but also there was like a flip side to that coin where I was also grieving for like the teenagehood that I didn't have, and I saw a lot of other people, especially queer people online, also having experienced that, saying like they couldn't be out when they were in their teen years, and like while they loved the show, it did bring about this like sense of grief for the time that they couldn't have and the experiences they weren't allowed to have or felt like they weren't allowed to have. And I definitely feel that with not just Heartstopper but any sort of teen film or like teen TV show or like YA novels that sort of err on the side of romanticizing that time, because I was deeply confused and depressed and anxiety ridden during my teen years, so any kind of media that like glorifies that time does tend to isolate me a little bit. But sometimes you just need some fucking joy. That's like what this year has taught me. I've had a lot of really low points, and you know what, sometimes it doesn't matter if things aren't realistic, you just need some bloody joy, and these books and the TV show provides that bloody joy. And also the books don't skirt away from those darker issues. They're less prevalent in the show, but the show does like sow seeds of like Charlie's eating disorder and some mental health struggles that come later on, and the books dive into that in more detail. So it's not all happy and rosy and rainbows, like perfect love story, and it's just about these two people who love each other so much, and that love helps them with their own struggles. It doesn't solve their problems, but it like makes it a heck of a lot easier to like navigate through the world. And they're just lovely, fun times. So I recommend, if you were like a cynic like me and thought this wouldn't work for you, I would give it a go. And if you don't want to buy the first volume, it's a webcomic, so you can kind of test it out, test the waters, dip your toe in, see if it works for you without like committing to a whole volume. I would recommend. And next up in August I read House of Hollow. Even though it was like 40 degrees outside, literally, I was like, it's spooky season in my head and I wanted to manifest the spooky cold weather, so I read House of Hollow. And this follows three sisters, Grey, Vivi, and the other one, Iris. And these sisters are infamous and like ethereal, and basically these three sisters, when they were younger, disappeared and then were returned weeks later, but their hair had gone white, their eyes were black, and they were missing memories of their time away. So there are lots of theories that were posed on the internet that these, you know, kids had been replaced by changelings and that they'd returned different and that their parents were scared of them. And years later, when the girls are teenagers, their father commits suicide because he believes that his daughters have been taken over by some dark force and he can't like live with it anymore. And when we pick up at the start of the novel, Iris, the youngest of the sisters, has been having some strange visions and some strange hallucinations and nightmares, and then her and her sister Grey find out that their eldest sister Vivi has mysteriously gone, nope, it's Iris. And Vivi, the youngest and the middle, realise that the eldest sister Grey, who's like this ethereal model fashion designer who's famous now, she has gone missing. So obviously they embark on a quest to find out not only what has happened to Grey, but like the mystery that is at the centre of all of their lives. And for the first half of the novel, I wasn't really sure I was sold on it. There's a lot of sort of lyrical and poetic language, which usually just does the trick for me, but it just felt there wasn't a lot of substance there. There was a lot of flowery language describing how ethereal and like strange and weird these sisters were, and there wasn't a lot actually showing that. And I know that like show don't tell is a bit of an overused phrase, and I don't tend to agree with that. I think sometimes you have to just tell a story. That's why we call it storytelling. Like I'm not immune to like being told things rather than everything having to be shown, but just it was quite slow. It took me quite a while to get into it, but then once I got into the last third of the novel, when like actual stuff started to happen and we started being drip fed some answers, that's when I really started to enjoy it a lot more. And then the flowery language was a lot more effective because it was actually backed up by things that were happening like canonically in the novel. But I guess for novels like these that are quite witchy, that are quite spooky, that are quite poetic and lyrical, I think I just prefer them not to be YA. And I don't know if that's kind of sacrilegious because I love the coming of age genre. I love YA as like a genre, as a medium. It's like my favourite genre of film. So I don't know if that's sacrilege for me to be like, this felt too teenagey. And I definitely think you can write about teenagers from flowery and intelligent point, but it just felt a little bit jarring in this. Like there were lots of really beautiful and like eerie descriptions that were then broken up by dialogue that felt quite juvenile, and maybe that was intentional, like, you know, you want them to feel like real teenagers, but I think in other stories I've read it's been a bit more effective because I guess the dialogue as well as the descriptions have this heightened sense of language. I don't know if that made any sense, but it's how I felt. So moving on. And next up in August I read Summerwater by Sarah Moss, and I adored this book so much. It's set during the summer solstice in this sort of dreary grey cabin park in Scotland, and there are these different caravans and different cabins where obviously people have sort of, well, not flocked, I was going to say flocked, but like it's not a popular destination by any means, but people have set up camp for the summer in this sort of windy, cold cabin park. And in the opening chapter we're following a woman who's gone out for a jog, and on this jog she's ruminating on the state of her marriage. Her husband is like a bit of a dickhead, and we're following her like stream of consciousness as she's jogging in the rain, and it's very propulsive. It's a very compelling chapter. And then the second chapter, or I guess the second vignette as I would call it, begins, and we're following an older gentleman who is in his sort of cabin park, and he has just made a tea for his wife, and he's having a quiet moment downstairs, again just thinking, being quite contemplative, thinking about his day, what he's going to do, and he sees the woman from the first chapter jogging past. And all of these vignettes are sort of stitched together by these people in the cabin park. So for example, like the man in the second chapter sees the woman from the first chapter jogging past, and then later on there's a teenager who takes his boat out and gets into a little bit of trouble on the lake and arrives back, you know, later than expected, and he's a bit bedraggled. And then the woman who the next chapter is about sees him dragging his canoe out of the lake. So they're all sort of stitched together by being in the same vicinity, but they're all very different characters who don't know each other. And I guess it's one of those novels where like nothing happens, and I can see that people would have that criticism about it, but for me that wasn't a criticism at all. It's just a book about people and about desire and about monotony and about where your mind goes when you're in such a boring, dreary place and the mind just wanders, and it's just so compelling. And Sarah Moss is so acute in her observations and also really quite dryly funny. One of my favourite vignettes was this woman who is a mother and has young kids, and her husband is like, oh, I'm going to take the kids out, you know, just give you some peace. And she's so stressed about making the most of this time, like, you know, whether she's going to read her book, is she going to have a bath, is she going to do this, is she going to do that, that she just whiles away the time and like does nothing. And the way it's written is just so funny because it's just so true. Like, you know, you stress so much about maximizing your time that it's just such a waste. And there's just little moments like that that, again, nothing groundbreaking is happening in terms of, you know, plot or story, but it just feels so true that it's such a joy to read about. And joy is a strange word to use because obviously the tone of the novel is quite bleak and the setting is quite bleak, but it's just filled with people that feel so real that you just can't not read it. It's just very compelling, and I would recommend it if you like Sarah Moss's writing. I'd read previously Ghost Wall, and I really enjoyed that, and I'm excited to check out her other novels. And to finish up August, I read One True Loves and Maybe Another Life, both by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and these are the kind of I don't know if they're rom-coms, but they're the romance novels that she published before the success and like the massive fame of Evelyn Hugo. So obviously I wasn't expecting them to kind of be on that level because they're obviously not as well known or as talked about as Evelyn, and Evelyn is still peak Taylor for me. But these are still fun. So maybe In Another Life follows a kind of dual timeline. I think it's a familiar trope that's been used. I think there's a movie called Sliding Doors which does like a similar thing, where basically we're following this one girl, what's her name, Hannah, and she's at a bit of a crossroads in her life. She's not really sure what she's doing. She's moved back home for the first time in years, and she just ended a relationship with a married man, so she's kind of floundering a little bit on her own, and she's like heading back home to just reflect. And then on her first night home she meets an ex at a bar, and they still have a bit of a flirty vibe, they have a bit of unfinished business, and in one timeline she decides to go home with him and that plays out, and then in the other timeline she doesn't go home with him but she gets hit by a car and wakes up in hospital. So then we're following dual timeline of like her having gone home with her ex and like rekindling those feelings and like all the things that means. And then in the other timeline she didn't go home with him but she got hit by a car and she's having a sort of flirty vibe with her doctor. And I think the general sort of vibe of the book is that like there isn't just one soulmate primed for all of us. Like life pushes us in different directions and like we will meet who we meet and we don't need to stress about it. So I enjoyed that, it was fun. And then One True Loves follows Emma and Jesse, who were a newlywed married couple, and then 1 year into their marriage Jesse goes off on like a work trip and his plane crashes and he is presumed dead. And then it's like I think 4 or 5 years later, or maybe longer, I'm not sure, years later it just says on the back, years later, Emma is obviously still grieving, but she's got to a point in her life where like she needs to sort of move on and find love again, and she's ready for that, and she lets this new man into her life, and then suddenly Jesse's not dead and he comes back and it's a bit stressful. And that's what the title One True Loves is about. You know, it's like, do we have only one true love in our life, or can we be torn between two loves and both of them are right for you in very different ways? I guess it's kind of similar to the crux of maybe Another Life, in the sense that, you know, we're not just destined for one person, and I enjoyed both. I think on the whole I preferred slightly One True Love just because like it's slightly more dramatic, you know, him coming back from the dead, and all of the like feelings that you know brings up. But they're both well written, and I think if you like Taylor Jenkins Reid, it's worth reading them just to complete your collection. But yeah, I don't know if these are ones that I would return to as readily as I would return to, say, Evelyn or Daisy, which are like my favourite of Taylor Jenkins Reid's books. And now we move on to the September pile. And just let's get it out of the way. We have another Taylor Jenkins Reid novel. I promise I'm not sponsored. I would love to be sponsored if that's a thing. Taylor, give me your money. But this is her newest release, Carrie Soto is Back, and I did a whole reading vlog on this detailing like what it's about and my thoughts and my anger at the size and format of this book. If you know, you know. So I'll link that in the description below. I don't need to waste any more time talking to you about it. Now, at the beginning of September I read and finished My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Tesha Moshfegh, and I really enjoyed this, and I couldn't really tell you why. So the premise of the book is basically there's this woman who feels really disillusioned with her life, you know, like nothing is really bringing her any joy. She's quite depressed, her life feels quite empty, she doesn't really have a lot of connections to other people, she's very lonely and isolated. And after the death of both of her parents, she is left with their estate and their money, and she has this apartment in New York, so she has all of her like material needs covered, so she doesn't really have to work or strive or do anything, and she kind of is in this limbo phase. And so she decides, instead of going to work, going to her job, you know, going to bars, keeping up the appearances of like, you know, a fulfilled life, she's going to just have a year of rest and relaxation where she takes a shit ton of prescription medication to stay asleep and like disengage with the world. And that is essentially the whole novel. It's her trying to procure these drugs, getting stronger and stronger drugs that she stays asleep longer and more deeply, and you know, it's interspersed with kind of ruminations on her childhood and her parents and her parents' death, and also the relationship that she has with her closest friend who she sort of despises, and the whole thing is basically about how, I guess, detached and alone she feels. And again, kind of like Summerwater, it's another novel that doesn't really give you a lot in terms of story or actually events happening, in the book, but it gives you a real insight into the stream of consciousness, into the inside of a character and how they're feeling and what they're thinking. And the writing is good enough that it creates that palpable atmosphere so that even when nothing is actually happening, you're still compelled to read further. Yeah, I would recommend it if it is something that strikes your fancy. If you enjoy books where not a lot happens the way that I do, I recommend. And next up we have Grown Ups by Marianne Keyes, which is a beast. One of the longest books that I've read this year, I think, if not the longest. I think it is the longest book that I've read so far this year. And I read this on like a 4-hour flight and then a 7-hour layover and then a couple of hours when I got to my destination. So this is a very good book for that reason. Like, it's chunky and it, you know, I was enveloped enough in the story that like it passed the time that needed to be passed. So in this story we're following 3 women, Jessie, Cara and Nell, and they're married to 3 brothers, Johnny, Ed and Liam. And then there are obviously their various children. And it took me like a couple chapters to get to grips to like who is who, but there's a very helpful family tree at the start of this. And basically we're just following the kind of family minutiae, and each section or each chapter is like a different family gathering. So I think we begin at like Easter, and then there's like somebody's birthday, somebody's barbecue. It's like all the times where like the entire family get together, and it's all of like the interactions and the resentments between all of them. So Jessie, for example, who's married to Johnny, she had a previous husband who was Johnny's best friend, but that husband died, and she has kids from that marriage. So obviously the kids from that marriage resent Johnny a bit because, you know, their mum started dating their dad's best friend, and that's like a bit of a betrayal. So there's kind of anxiety there. But I think in the midst of all these sort of what I would call, I guess, like minor family stress, you kind of like money or political differences that kind of come to the fore. I think the conflict that I was most invested in emotionally was the one with Cara, and in the novel her eating disorder makes a comeback. I think she's struggled in the past with disordered eating and bulimia, but in the novel, over the course of the novel and these kind of family gatherings, it starts to really come back in a bad way, and she has a lot of denial around that, and it's about how her family start to notice and about how, I guess, that affects the entire family, how it has a ripple effect. And like I said, that was the thread that I guess I was the most interested in, and I was sort of compelled enough to keep reading. It's like a beast of a book, so if I wasn't interested I wouldn't have finished it. But I guess it's one that I just don't feel I'll ever need to return to. Like, I'm grateful it kept me company for the hours that I needed to be kept company on that layover, but it's not one that I think made like a massive impression on me. But I would be interested in potentially checking out Marianne Keyes' other novels. I know she's a very prolific author and this was well written, so I'm sure that there is another book that might, I guess, make more of a lasting impression on me. And then I read You and Me on Vacation, and what can I say, it's hyped for a reason. And in this book we're following Poppy and Alex, who are these 2 best friends who've known each other since their, I think, undergraduate year of university or college, whatever you want to say. And this friendship is a very close one in the sense that like whenever either of them have had boyfriends or girlfriends, the boyfriend or girlfriend has always felt slightly threatened by the friendship between Poppy and Alex. And every year Poppy and Alex have a holiday that they go on because Poppy is a travel journalist, so she gets lots of these trips for free, and obviously she just loves travelling, so she writes about their experiences. But then they have this falling out that we're not entirely sure the details of what happened, and then after like 2 years of not speaking, Poppy reaches out to Alex for one last sort of holiday together where everything is gonna come to the surface. All of these unspoken feelings and resentments that they've held for these like last 12 years are gonna come out on this like last holiday. And what can I say? I'm a sucker for romance. I'm a sucker for tension and yearning. And I read it while I was on holiday, so I was in the mood to like believe in this whirlwind like holiday romance, you know? It's not holiday romance, they've obviously known each other for like 10 years before they go on this holiday, but just like getting swept up in like the romance of a new place. I was willing to buy into that as I was reading this on a rainy beach in Georgia, so I had a good time. And the last book that I read in September was The Maidens by Alex Michaelides, and I read this for a Dark Academia reading vlog, which has been growing a bit dusty. I was going to read this and Babel for that vlog and like compare the two, because this one is set in Cambridge and Babel is set in Oxford, so that would be quite funny to read like a Cambridge novel and an Oxford novel and just like chit chat and like talk about both of them. And I read this one really quickly, and I thought like the vlog was going really well, and then the film festival in London happened and I got swept up in a bunch of screenings, and it took me a very long time to finish Babel. But also Babel is a lot longer and the language is a lot more lush, and I just wanted to be slower in that because I wanted to like immerse myself in the world. There's a lot of technical elements about like the magic system in that world, and I just didn't want to like rush through it. So that vlog is coming, but it's a little bit delayed, so you're getting a little bit of a preview in this wrap up. And I've read The Maidens, and I might go into a bit more detail in that vlog, but essentially it's fine. It's a dark academia novel set in Cambridge, and at the beginning of the novel a woman is murdered in Cambridge, and we're following Mariana, who is like a psychotherapist, and her niece, I believe it is it her niece? It's someone who has like a vague relation to her. I think it's her niece. Her niece is a student at Cambridge University who's had a lot of problems with anxiety, so Mariana goes down to Cambridge to like be emotional support for her niece, but while she's there she's getting a bit of a weird vibe off this one professor who has this weird secret culty society, and she starts to investigate a little bit, and all is not as it seems. And I was enjoying it. I sped through it. It's written in a very compelling way, and it has a lot of literary references, which I appreciated. As soon as I clocked that the main character was called Mariana and they had like a Tennyson quote at the beginning, I was like, oh, I read that poem at A-level. And the poem is, I think it's called Mariana, and it's by Tennyson, and it's about this woman, Mariana, who's like waiting for her husband to return, and it's like her just like standing at a window for the entirety of the poem. And we wrote a lot of essays about that poem, and there's not a lot that happens, but I remember being like, oh, mood, she just stands and waits for love. But the Mariana in the book has also lost her boyfriend, her significant other. He drowned before the events of the murder, so she's experiencing that grief at the same time as like dealing with this murder. So like I said, I finished it quickly, it's compelling, but it does feel a little bit silly as we get to the end and like the big answer is revealed. I just don't think it sticks the landing. It just feels a bit silly, a little bit for shock value. And it feels less like a dark academia novel and more like a sort of thriller, murder mystery that just happens to take place in Cambridge. I mean, the literary references do help it feel a bit more academic, and there's a lot of nice descriptions of like the campus and stuff, but it does just feel like a sort of police procedural that just happens to be in Cambridge rather than anything to do with academia or, you know, being a student and that kind of world. It just feels more like a backdrop rather than like a driving force of the book. A solid 3-star book. Like, you know, I liked it in the moment, it compelled me, I don't need to read it again, and it was a bit silly towards the end. So yeah, that's everything I read in July, August and September. Totally forgot what month came after July for a second. That's what happens when you film these videos at 2 AM. So I should be going, and thank you so much for being here. I know my schedule is like non-existent, but I do appreciate if you just want to pop up when I pop up. That's nice, I appreciate you, and I will see you soon with another video. Thanks for watching, bye. Why did I do a double wave? That looks so weird. God.